want to welcome everyone to our recording today. Behind Closed Doors, How the Los Angeles City Council Recording is a case study of the exercise of political power through racism in the U.S. My name is Mindy Romero, and I am the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy. Today's webinar runs from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific time. It's being recorded and will be available soon through CID's website and, of course, also distributed through our listserv and on social media. As I think most of our viewers are aware, this webinar is the first in a series titled Behind Closed Doors that explores the entrenchment of racism in U.S. politics and its impact on political power and representation in communities. Something recently brought further into the spotlight by the secret recording of a meeting of Los Angeles City Council members, a meeting discussing LA redistricting, where, of course, horrific racist remarks were made. This series is co-hosted by the California Black Freedom Fund, the Latino Community Foundation, and the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund. I want to thank all of those organizations for their partnership in making this webinar series possible. I want to specifically thank leaders from those organizations that partnered with us in the planning and the thinking around this series. Mark Philpott, Christian Arana, and Unsuk Lee. I'm very grateful for their collaboration. Before we begin, I'd like to give an overview of the full series and its schedule. It's the same schedule that we've sent out through our networks, but for those of you that might not have seen that, and we'll place the information in the chat along with registration links in a moment for those of you that might be interested. So in addition to today's webinar, we will, in upcoming, present the following webinar conversations: Behind Closed Doors, White Supremacy and the Roots of Anti-Blackness Among Latino and Asian American and Pacific Islander Communities. That's January 19th, 10 to 11 a.m. Next, Behind Closed Doors, Redistricting. Does it really have to be zero-sum politics? How multiracial coalitions have worked together to build political power for all. And that's February 22nd, noon to 1. And lastly, Behind Closed Doors, How Communities Move Forward toward dismantling the relationship between political manipulation and racism. That's March 15th, noon to 1 p.m. I think it's important that we state our goal with these sessions, including today's webinar. Our purpose is, in these sessions, is that they serve as a public space for open and challenging conversations, examining the nation's entrenched relationship between racism and politics. We know that the leaked recording in Los Angeles was just the tip of an ever-present iceberg, providing a very public example of just how deeply rooted racism is in our electoral system and overall power structures. We think it's long overdue that we have candid conversations, but that we have more candid conversations, elevated and open discussions about these realities and what can be done to meaningfully address them moving forward. We also recognize that this series can only provide the perspectives and conversation it provides. And we hope to see many more different types of conversations beyond this webinar series, both public and private, and of course, actual action taken. And we know there is much good work, of course, that's occurring now on this topic, but we need, and I'm sure everyone here would agree, that we need much more of it. So lastly, due to time constraints, we will not, I just want to make sure everybody knows we're not going to be providing an overview of the contents of those city council recordings or the recording today. We're working under the assumption that if you're joining us today, then you're aware of the recording, you've read about its contents, perhaps you've even listened to it, hopefully you've listened to it. We want to use our limited time today to hear the thoughts and perspectives from our panelists, and we've only asked one thing of them today, which is to speak their truth on the topic. Okay, let's jump into the webinar. I'd like to introduce our three distinguished panelists, and in a moment, links to their full bios will be in the chat. We'll just give brief bios because of time. First is Dr. Manuel Pastor. He's a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, USC. He holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's currently the director of the Equity Research Institute, ERI. Dr. Pastor's research has generally focused on issues of economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities and the social movement seeking to change those realities. 2021 saw the publication of two new books, South Central Dreams, Finding Homes and Building Community in South LA, and Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. His previous 2018 book, State of Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future, was lauded in New York Times, in a New York Times review as concise, clear, and convincing. Dr. Pastor, thank you very much for joining. Okay, Odilia Romero. She is the co-founder and executive director of CIELO. She is also an independent interpreter for Indigenous communities in Los Angeles and throughout California. She has over a decade of experience organizing Indigenous migrant communities. Her organizing knowledge and experience are held in high regard with multiple academic publications, awards, and lectures in universities across the United States, including Johns Hopkins, UCLA, and here, USC. Ms. Romero has published on the challenges of organizing in Indigenous communities, developing women's leadership, and preparing a new generation of youth. Thank you, Ms. Romero, for joining us today. And last but not least, Erika D. Smith. She's a columnist for the LA Times, writing about diversity and people and places, or diversity of people and places across California. She joined the Times in 2018 as an assistant editor and helped expand coverage of the state's housing and homelessness crisis. She previously worked at Sacramento Bee, so I met her up there, where she was a columnist and editorial board member covering housing, homelessness, and social justice issues. Before the Bee, Ms. Smith wrote for the Indianapolis Star and Akron Beacon Journal. She's a recipient of the Sigma Delta Chi Award for Column Writing, a graduate of Ohio University, and a native of long-suffering Sportstown, Cleveland. Thank you all very much. Again, welcome. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in to our first question of the day, if I can get my notes together to do that. All right. Question number one, and this is primarily directed towards Manuel, and I will ask the other panelists when he is finished with his answer to jump in as you desire, as you see fit, just to highlight, to add, to change anything. So the question is, we know that the U.S. is a nation built on the systematic exclusion of and suppression of communities of color. Today, we're discussing specifically the exercise of political power through racism. Can you explain what is meant generally by this topic? How do scholars and others attempt to define it?
Good to be with you this morning. Not an easy question. So one of the things I guess I'd like to start with and help bring up later is, America's founded really in a duality, because there's all these aspirations of freedom, self-expression, democratic government, and at the same time, deeply rooted in slavery, anti-Blackness, and clearly anti-indigeneity and genocide. So we have a nation that's, founded both on aspirations of freedom and the suppression of people of color. And, that's the legacy and the history, and it's been the political practice of the United States since, its earliest founding till the current moment. The other duality that I think occurs in major American cities as well is how that plays out in terms of whether or not the politics of race are a politics of ethnic succession, that is one group rising in numbers and dominating over another, or ethnic coalition, groups coming together to try to find out what is their common set of interests at the same time that they have, my co-author Angela Glover Blackwell and Stuart Quo and I called it uncommon common ground, trying to figure out not just what is the lowest common denominator of what you share, but where is the place that you need to challenge each other to forge long-lasting coalitions. That's been a big part of what my own political and intellectual history has been. I've been struck that I'm on the 35-year anniversary of forming with Mark Ridley Thomas, former supervisor, former city council person, and Stuart Quo, former head of the Asian American Pacific Legal Center, which became Asian Americans Advancing Justice, a group in the late 1980s called the New Majority Task Force, which is just as Los Angeles was becoming majority people of color, we sought to bring together African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific Islanders together to try to ask the question, what would it be to act not like a minority in which you react to what's there, but as a new majority proposing a more equitable economic and political system. So I think we always have this duality between ethnic succession and ethnic coalition as well. And what that, cruel, callous, and careless conversation revealed was a politics of ethnic succession rather than ethnic coalition. And I think that as much as we will later talk about the tone of that conversation, the anti-Indigenous stuff that got said, the homophobic stuff that got said, the anti-Black stuff that got said, it's important to realize that the substance of the conversation was also a kind of zero-sum politics in which the thought was that increasing Latino political power necessarily came at the cost of Black political power. And yet, I really am fundamentally convinced that when we strengthen Black political power in California, in Los Angeles, in California, in the United States, given the defining, fundamental, and persistent nature of anti-Blackness and the way in which that carved the sort of relationships of inequity that scar our urban landscape. When we enhance Black political power, we are improving the political prospects for Latinos, for Asian Americans, for Indigenous folks who live within Los Angeles, which, by the way, has the largest Native population in the United States, and we improve the conditions for progressive politics. So those are the dualities that I think are there. It's not a simple question of just domination. We've always had these aspirations of freedom against the realities of oppression. We've always had these aspirations of coalition against the politics of succession.
Thank you very much. Erika and Odilia, do you have anything that you'd like to add from your perspective?
Well, agree with Manuel, but also like for us as Indigenous displaced people, just the narrative of the whole movement of immigrant rights it's a country built of immigrants. It's a country built by, it's an American dream, and it's built by immigrants. Erasing the existence of our relatives that continue to live and exist here in the United States, right? So we have to go back and change that narrative and be inclusive. That when we talk about this country, the United States, we talk about Indigenous people from the Cherokee to the Navajo, that they continue to live and exist in this very country, and they're still struggling to retain their lands, for their sovereignty, right? Like, we need to bring that back into our discourse, because then we too contribute to these, Manuel says, aspiration of freedom, by erasing that the real landowners of this country continue to exist.
And I would just add, one of the things is not being a native Angelino or Californian and growing up in the Midwest, since we're talking about this concept nationally, just that coalition that, Manuel, you said you built 35 years ago, is acting as a majority. I do think it's so different than a way so many cities in this country, they approach local politics, that Black folks, Latinos, Indigenous folks, that they come at city politics not acting as a majority, even if in that urban area they are. They kind of come at it in a more subservient way. And I do think that's one of the things that sets LA apart, and one of the many things that makes us, kind of the leader, and what happens here happens nationally, good or bad. But, I do think it's something that gives us a particular window into the way that race has an effect on politics and public policy that is so different. And so I do, just like I said, coming from different parts of this country, I can see the difference almost immediately. And that's one of the things I think that plays into this.
Thank you. Next question. So let's talk about the Los Angeles City Council recording. What is, and I'll take this in order. I'll ask Odilia to go first. What is your reaction to the recording? Was the content of the conversation, which was manipulation of redistricting, and the level of racism expressed a surprise to you, expected, something else, and why? Well,
having working from a human rights office at CIELO, at one point you have to numb yourself. And this is unfortunate that you have to numb yourself in order to continue the work that you do. Because for us, we get these calls every day. I mean, I wasn't surprised by their comments because this is what we deal with every day from our Latino relatives, right? From our Mexican relatives, that, you know, and their words were very impactful to the community itself. But for us, in order for us to do this work, we have to numb ourselves. Our Department of Center for Indigenous Language and Power, we attend like 600 to 700 calls a month where people call you. We have another Oaxacan. You know, we have another Indigenous person. Can you send me an interpreter that speaks 20 Mayan languages? Can you send me somebody that speaks Oaxacan? You know, can you send me somebody that speaks these dialects? I mean, their words is just kind of shows you the reality that Indigenous people live and that impact, the deadly impacts that their words have in our daily life, from the receptionist at a hospital to the receptionist at the courthouse to the school district. When Latinos think about in such way, it impacts the service that we get. It impacts our due process. It impacts our healthcare. So for us, it was not surprising at all. We hear it every day and all day long. Our Department of Interpretation has therapy because of the vicarious trauma that they have to endure daily. So that tells you the impact of these words. Not surprised at all. It really, in a sense, it's good for us that it came out because people would say that Odilia is a crazy woman going out there saying that Latinos and Mexicans and are racist towards Indigenous people. And, you know, since there's no number of our existence, out of the 62 million plus Latinos, we probably make 20%. I don't know, Manuel, you do the numbers, you know, but we don't exist. So if we don't exist, we're not talked about. And when we're talked about is in this derogatory way that Nudi spoke about us, the services that we're going to get, or we're not going to get any services, period. So yeah, not surprised. It just really put it out there. And I hope people reflect now, you know, become that uncomfortable person at your table, at your Christmas dinner table, when people make derogatory comments towards Indigenous people, towards Oaxacans.
Erika, I'll ask you.
Well, you know, kind of to what you said, I mean, I wasn't really shocked or surprised. I mean, particularly about the language that was the anti-Black language that was used. I mean, you know, we hear this, Black folks in the city everywhere. We hear this all day, every day, particularly in this environment, in this country right now. You know, I think what was most striking to me, and in a minute, I'll link to the LA Times. We did our annotated version of that recording, which might be helpful for anybody who doesn't understand all the political wrangling and what they were talking about. But I think what was most interesting to me is being, you know, on the ground, covering this community. One of the things I've heard from Black Angelenos, you know, for the entire time that I've been here is this fear that, you know, this Latino Black tension, that Latinos are going to take over city politics and they're not going to care about Black people, and, you know, our needs are going to go unmet. And I think that one of the things that jumped out almost immediately in that recording was this kind of sense that this is going to be a confirmation of so many people's fears. And what is the impact of that going to be? And I think that that, to me, I think is really going to be the legacy of this. It's going to be this breakdown in trust, right? And how does that play out? And I think that was a thing that, though none of it, I guess, was entirely shocking, even though just the level of like how many different groups of people they managed to insult in like an hour, you know, it was just the ramifications and the timing of it and all of the other things that surrounded it. So
Thank you. Manuel?
Well, for anybody who studies and works in communities, again, not surprising. I mean, people who are immigrant Latinos come from Latin America arrive with the anti-Black attitudes, with colorism, with anti-indigeneity, and arriving in the United States is not destined to beat that out of you. Instead, it helps to reinforce it, given the racial hierarchy that exists within the United States. So not particularly surprised, although I will say that in the circles I've run in, I've never, you know, heard that sort of stuff, but that just might be the circles I run in. The thing I think that is really striking, I've been thinking quite a bit about, is the trust factor that Erika was talking about, because I think it's extraordinarily important that Black communities have Black-only spaces to talk about issues that are critical to Black communities. I think it's critical for Latinos to be able to get together and, joke about what the lyrics really mean in Bad Bunny's Tito Me Preguntó. I think it's really important for Indigenous folks to be able to get together on their own. I think it's really important for queer folks to be able to get together on their own. When that happens, what you're always hoping is that the conversation will be a conversation as though the other was in the room. That if it's Latinos only and something that's anti-Black gets said, that someone in the room will, as I think Odilia mentioned for the Christmas dinner, actually call out the attitude, call out the statement, and engage in a conversation. Solidarity is what you do when no one is looking. And the 4 people who participated in that conversation thought no one was looking and no solidarity was in evidence.
Thank you. How does, and Manuel, I'll ask you to start us off on this one. How does the LA City Council recording demonstrate the use of racism in the acquisition or maintenance of political power in Los Angeles? I know we've covered some of this, but, and certainly any relevant historical context that you want to include in that, in your answer would be helpful.
Well, I think a lot of this is in a way obvious. So I guess maybe to get at the less obvious part of it, it's important to realize that occurred. And at the same time, we just elected to the mayor's seat a community organizer from South LA whose fundamental work in South Los Angeles was building Black-brown solidarity around what it would take to address the issues that exist in that place. And I think one of the costs of that conversation we're spending a whole lot of time talking about it, and we're coming up with meaner things to say about Kevin De Leon, which, I think we're kind of getting exhausted about this. And I think what it winds up obscuring is what Erika was talking about and what I hope I contributed to in my younger age, which was, what is the power of coalition? What, when we actually do come together, and I mean in an honest way, not a kumbaya, let's all get together, not talk about our differences, but talk about our differences, talk about our different needs, talk about our different priorities, and figure what people can work on together. There is a rich history. It, goes all the way back to the California Eagle, the Black paper, being one of the main supporters of the Mexican-American youth who were on trial in the Sleepy Lagoon trial. There's a long history of coalition building, and there was a shift, as Erika mentioned, to be able to think about how that could lead to majority political power if exercised in unity. And what I worry about is the duality is disappearing in our conversation, that we're focusing on what got shattered and not this long history of what's being built. Maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I've been at it for a while, and I know that there's some good stuff that we need to lift up, even as we rightly bring up the deep critiques. I think that Odilia was lifting up about the erasure of Indigenous people from many of the concerns that get expressed. And I know what Eric and I have talked about as well in other conversations, the sense of Black loss in the city and the idea that Latino political power will eclipse a place where Black folks have had significant voice culturally, politically, and in other ways.
Odilia.
Well, for us, just following what Manuel was saying, there's some positive things, right? Because we organized the march and the community really came together. And some of the expressions were from that community, because all of us belong to Indigenous communities. Is like, these words were told to us at the restaurant 50 years ago, at the factories, and the fact that there's an organization that stood up for us. People cried when they shared their stories about how these was so triggering. But then the other comment that they say, hey, only the Black community came to stand with us. And that was very powerful, because at that march, it was the Black community, and 2 Latino organizations that stood with us. At their press conference, it was like 3-4 Latino organizations, the Black community and the Indigenous community that stood with us. It was very clear to us that, and they were wondering, that the Black community were like, wait, you're Indigenous, explain this to me. So it was a beautiful relationship that developed from there. Suddenly, a lot of people realized that we're not the regular Mexicans, that we speak another language, that we don't speak Spanish, right? So it was a moment to build. The first time we had a conversation with Black Lives Matter, the community actually during the encampment at Kevin De Leon's house, the Indigenous business people deliver food, deliver waters. So that was very unique. And for us, this has taken a lot of our time. We're a human rights organization. So thanks to our Mayan relatives that are part of the team, that the Oaxacan team was able to go and protest and be at City Hall, so that the office didn't stop. But yeah, we fell behind. It's just taking too much of our time. He's not going to resign. It's getting worse and worse. And we need to build on what we're going to work on with the Black community, with the Indigenous community. But the one really effect that was very violent coming from the Kevin De Leon's team, for me as an Indigenous woman, was a meeting with the Mexican federations. And at that meeting, it was through Zoom. The agreement was no recording, otherwise it will be another scandal. But literally they say, Odilia, you don't want to go down in history as the woman that dismantled the Latino political power. And I said, no, I'm not going in history that way, because I wasn't in that conversation. But literally there's no racism. They were stating facts. You are short, you are brown. Indigenous people happen to be always protesting and stopping the development of political powers. That violence was felt because it was like very important organizations that were in this meeting along with other Indigenous Oaxacans. It was very paternalistic. And when you are in that conversation and these organizations service Indigenous people too, the treatment that they get, right? So it's a long-lasting effect that we need to work on. Like, how do we work with these organizations and have diversity training? What is racism? Because apparently they don't know what it is. If they agree that these were state facts, that we were short and brown, it's very concerning to me that you're an immigrant rights organization and you advocate for immigrant rights, yet you're saying that these are like simple facts. So I think for us at CIELO, we need to move forward. And how do we build a relationship with the Black community? How do we, have to educate the Latino community about our existence? And for that, we need in the academic support, right? What you guys write is like a Bible for the world. And if we don't exist in your writing, then we don't exist.
Erika?
Yeah, I would just, add to, what you were saying about the protest outside of Councilmember De Leon's house. I was there that night, and it was, and it kind of, to piggyback on I think it was the first council meeting after the tape was released, and there was this, multicultural, multi-ethnic coalition that descended on City Hall, and, basically it was like, this man must resign. It was a similar kind of, I think feeling outside of his house. I'm not sure which particular march, but the one that I went to, I think it was one of the first ones, but at the encampment that Black Lives Matter had set up, and so, I do think it's interesting that, as these recordings have come out, of course, there's been this focus on the breakdowns between these communities and coalitions, but there's also been this new coalition that's kind of built up around, what has happened. And I think it's interesting because even yesterday's city council meeting, which was chaotic to say the least, but, Kevin De Leon showed up. There was some back and forth between other council members. There's a lot of protesters there, but, there were people of all races and ethnicities there as part of that group of protesters. And I think the question now is how do you shift that newer coalition, or maybe a reconstituted coalition? I'm not sure how you want to describe it, back towards something that's more positive maybe. And I guess the question is like, can you do that with the current circumstances? But I think that's kind of the challenge going forward. It's not, I don't see it so much as a return to the past, but like, how do you learn from that and kind of reconstitute, renew those coalitions with, oftentimes newer, younger members who have different ideals about what kind of coalitions we should have and what those values should be. And I think that's also part of the challenge too going forward.
Thank you. And before we end our conversation today, we will talk a little bit more in depth about moving forward. So next question. What do the reactions to the LA City Council recording tell us about the differing ways that leaders and the public interpret the conversation and the mechanisms that led to it? What are some of the reasons, motivations for these differences as you see it? And I will ask Erika to start us off on this question.
Sure. I mean, I think it's really interesting. And I think we're seeing some of these shifts in how people interpret it starting to play out probably more in the last week than I think we've had since the recording was first out. I mean, I think, when the recording was first released, I think the response was universal shock and anger. I think that's pretty consistent. And of course, that's still the case now. But I think that what's happened is as the push for Kevin De Leon to resign has not resulted in his resigning, I think that there was an incident last week, a lot of you I'm sure probably know, where he got involved with the scuffle with an activist at an event in Lincoln Park that, a lot of community members were not very happy about, understandably so. You see he has some supporters within his district as well. And so I think that now this tape has become less about the actual what was said on the tape. And it seems like it's also more just about Kevin De Leon and his resistance to resigning. And so I think that we're kind of moving down the I don't even know what you want to call it, but moving away from what was the initial point of anger to new points. And to me, the question is, in talking about moving forward, is kind of to what I was saying a few minutes ago, is can the city and the city council move forward with him still on the council? Or is he going to be required to resign? And he can't, nobody can really force him to resign except for the voters. And if he's got and who knows, if he's got a number of supporters who are willing to back him up, maybe that won't happen. But either way, it's going to probably take some weeks and some months. And so there's the immediate circumstance of how do you either work around him, work with him? How do you build coalitions around him? How do you rebuild trust when he's still there? And I think those are the hard questions that are going to be confronting the council when they come back from their winter break. It's also going to be, even though the mayor has no jurisdiction over the council, Mayor Bass, as Manuel pointed out, her background in community organizing, building coalitions, I'd have to imagine that she will have some involvement in trying to make peace in some sense there. Otherwise, her agenda might be imperiled. Yesterday, she had an emergency declaration about homelessness that, people weren't sure entirely that it was going to get voted on because of the chaos at the city council. I mean, it did, and it was approved and pushed forward. But I mean, I could easily see these kinds of, this kind of chaos at City Hall, at the city council, threatening larger efforts that affect everybody in the city. So I think it behooves the city and city leaders to find a way to move forward that isn't just like straight up breakdown chaos every single time the city council meets at City Hall.
Thank you. And Manuel, I'll ask you to take the question next. And it's again, what do the reactions make sure I'm off of mute. What do the reactions to the LA City Council recording tell us about the differing ways that leaders in the public interpret the conversation? What are some of the reasons for those differences?
A couple of different implications that maybe we haven't lifted up, although what I'm reminded of is that the first person I talked to about this was actually Erika, because I was getting on an airplane in Denver, looking at my phone going, wow, that's some pretty big news. And Erika called me up for my reaction. And I think I said it in the first phone call, but I talked to you a little bit later, that really what happened was the four people who participated in that conversation forfeited leadership. So there's, you can have this like he should resign conversation. The leadership actually just got forfeited. So I think there's not, it's going to be very difficult for him to be effective in any kind of a way. I think he certainly got his supporters who showed up at the LA City Council. But I think when you move to a recall election, the whole question about whether the council person can be effective getting anything done is going to have a big impact on voters, as well as whatever reaction there is to what he said and what he did. I think there are a couple of different ripple effects to kind of keep in mind here. One is that this has really been challenging to the Latino political establishment. All four people who participated in that conversation, head of the Fed, Ron Herrera, Nori Martinez, Gil Cedillo, Kevin De Leon, were an important part of a Latino political establishment that had been able to secure some degree of strength and voice. And the newest people in the council, Eunice Hernandez, Hugo Soto Martinez, actually come from a very different formation, more multicultural, more left-based, et cetera. Monica Rodriguez, again, not as much a traditional part of the Latino political machine in Los Angeles. And so I think that's a very big earthquake in Los Angeles politics. I think the other thing to realize is that the council, with one exception, Tracy Park, actually swung pretty far left in this last election. And that has a big impact. You saw it just yesterday on the vote with regard to renters' rights and how many more people are supportive of renters' rights on the council, nearly a majority. So I think that, was in some ways provoked by the reaction to this conversation, that gave a little more sort of wind to the sails of people who are presenting an alternative point of view, who are talking about a different kind of Latino politics, who are talking about renters' rights, et cetera. And I think those are going to have ripple effects as we move forward, along with a mayor who comes from a progressive tradition and who has staked all of her political capital on resolving a problem, homelessness, that has bedeviled the previous administration. Is, I think, an increasing recognition in the Black Angelino community that 20% of Black Angelinos are either immigrants themselves or the sons and daughters of immigrants. And so that presence is also a way to think about the new alliances that will be here in the future.
Thank you. Absolutely. Odilia.
Well, for us as an indigenous organization, as you asked, like different interpretations of these conversations. For example, the fact that, our Latino relatives were like, these are facts. You are short and brown. It's worrisome. It's worrisome because how do we move forward if these are facts to them, right? How do we move forward? Like for us, it's very important that the city council has a language access plan for indigenous people and people that don't speak the dominant languages. LA has a large diversity of language, not only indigenous languages from Latin America, but also the Garifuna language, Haitian languages. How do we serve the city? And as long as this chaos continues in City Hall, caused by KDL not wanting to resign, how are we going to move forward with a good language access plan with full funding, for indigenous migrants, for people that don't speak the language? I mean, at this point, people go interpret it in many ways. However, they seem like colorism from the Latino Mexican relatives. But for us, the prejudice against indigenous people, against Black people is there. It has always been there. It will continue to be there. And we, as indigenous people and Black people, we need to continue organizing. But how do we get past these? We're stuck at City Hall right now. The protesters continue to protest because it is what needs to be done. But KDL refusing to resign has put us in we can't go either way. Like we're stuck. And that is going to cause a problem to all of us, the constituents, right? Our language access plan will not pass because I am not going to go and speak at City Council because I'm in support of the protesters, right? But even if I do go speak, I don't know if it's going to get voted because it's chaos. So I think we need to find a way to organize and have conversations, like how do we move forward, because this is impacting us all in different ways, and not only Indigenous people, but every single person in this county, including KDL's constituents, right? So I really think that we are in quite predicament right now because we're not moving forward, and that's a problem. That's a huge problem because the city has needs. LA City residents, we have a lot of needs, a lot of things, budgeting's happening between now in the next few months, when they come back from break. Like, how is that going to impact every one of us? And I think, the people have asked me, like, what would you tell KDL, like, if you saw him in person? I think I would like, let's reason. Let's talk about this, how we move our entire city forward. Like, if you need to resign, go ahead. If the voters are going to do the recall and they push you to resign, that's good. But meanwhile, how do we move forward? Because right now, the incident on Friday, also again today, like, we're not moving forward. And I'm worried about the city, not just Indigenous people, but the entire city.
Thank you. Well, let's talk about moving forward now. So our last question, we're going to tackle that as well as the consequences that have happened thus far. So here's the question. Thus far, what have been, from your perspective, the consequences of the take beyond the council member resignations? And of course, we've already noted that we've only had actually one council member resign, not Cedillo or De Leon yet. What have been the consequences politically, impact on intergroup relations, coalition building, other types of impacts? Please cover whatever you think you want to cover and highlight. And second, in the short term, and we know webinar 4, we're going to be talking about the long term in terms of moving forward, but in the short term, what should be done to move forward towards healing while also seeking real change, right, with that distinction? So first, if you want to please, each of you, and I'll ask Erika to start us off here. What are the consequences as you've seen them thus far? And then what can we do? What do we need to do in the short term, at least, to move forward?
Give me the hard question first. Well, I think, not to belabor the point, but I think the biggest consequences has been, well, there's a couple, but I think the biggest one has been that trust factor between Black and Brown communities, and what does that look like? I mean, I don't think it's as bad as some people think it is, but I don't think it's as great as some people would hope it is. That's kind of my sense of things. I think there's room for improvement. I think the thing that gives me hope is there are several people in the city that know how to do this. A lot of, and now we have a mayor who built her career on that, who's in charge of the city, which is helpful. And people who are on the ground that are doing this and are committed to doing this work, that have never, given up doing this work. And so that's hopeful and helpful. But, I do think there's forces, and this isn't a good or a bad thing, it's just demographics. I mean, the reality is our population is changing, and fair representation is an issue that we have to talk about. And now talking about fair representation is always a fraught topic. And now it's on top of that, we have this recording, which has colored that conversation, which makes everything far more difficult. And then there's all of these, and I think maybe some of the good things that are coming out of this maybe will be a look at redistricting and how we do this process, which is, obviously allows a lot of potential corruption. So, which we've seen, at least attempting to meddle with the maps. And so I think if we can have an independent commission in charge of that, I think that would be helpful. I think that's one of the positive things. But I think the broader question kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, is like, I do honestly feel like in a lot of ways, the city is kind of stuck right now. And it's not stuck in the sense of, people aren't out there doing coalition building, aren't like repairing relationships. That is the case. But I think that effect on how we move forward on public policy, on what, motions get passed, what actually gets done in the city at a time when there are so many needs. That really worries me. Worries me as a resident. It worries me as a columnist. And I think it is really unfair that, looking at this, it's one person that's kind of got us stuck. And that is extremely aggravating, I think, not just to me, obviously, but to lots and lots of people. And so there's this question of what do we do with this situation? And that, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge next month when the council comes back for the next 4 to 5 months. And what does that look like? I don't have answers to that question, of course, but I think it does deeply concern me.
Thank you. Manuel?
So I did a sneaky academic thing about putting in a few consequences into the last answer about the city moving left and the scrambling of the traditional Latino political coalitions or establishment, because that's what academics do. We know the questions that are coming up and we sneak in our answers just in case. But let me just add one more consequence, which I think resonates with something Erika was saying about distrust and overcoming it, and then the immediate stuff that you asked about. It has to do with the election and the election of Karen Bass and the contest with Rick Caruso, where he made a really big play for the Latino vote. And the fact that he did relatively well with Latinos was actually overstated. It was overstated because if you look at the way the late vote broke after the vote that broke because it was the vote that got counted. That's the people who voted late, either mail or, arriving a couple of days later. A lot of that was Latino, young, etc. That was breaking 60-40 for Bass. If you go back and look at the history of Latino polling, Latinos are not adverse to voting for a business person in ways that other groups are often quite scared about. So there are a lot of reasons for looking at the election and how Latinos broke. But in light of the tape and the attitudes that got expressed, there was a lot of concern about whether that Latino vote for Caruso was anti-Black. And I think those interpretive concerns are going to remain. The other thing I would say, less a consequence and maybe moving ahead. If you were asking like that, I guess 3 sessions from now, you're going to focus on long-term and what can we say about stuff we should do immediately. And what I still remember is in the wake of the LA civil unrest, many of us were moving from meeting to meeting, thinking if we just went to one more meeting, we'd actually solve something, which of course frequently happens and might be happening right now. And actually in a reconstituted meeting of that new majority task force, an activist leaned back and said, you know what? There's an immediate need to think long-term. And out of that group came the campaign for a living wage, came the idea of trying to tie employment opportunities to residents in South LA, came the idea of challenging the ports, came the idea of building coalitions between communities. So what I'd like to suggest is there's an immediate need to think long term, that if we're looking at sort of immediate fixes, we're not getting into which would be, I would say, transactional organizing. We're not getting into the transformational organizing and community leadership development that will allow us to combat anti-Blackness, colorism, and anti-indigeneity in the Latino community and in other communities, to combat xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments that exist in multiple communities, to really address these concerns and build lasting coalitions. So please think about the long term as well as what we need to do right now.
Thank you very much. Odilia.
Okay, well, I think I agree with Erika. We need an independent people's counsel to the redistricting. It cannot be left in the hands of politicians. It should be in the hands of people, because at the end, people are the ones that get impacted. It is us that live in this district that get impacted, right? So it needs to be handled by the people. So that will be one suggestion for me, but also like Erika said, it's worrisome that all these motions are getting passed that are impacting us because we're not there. We can't be there. But also like for us, it's like also important, for example, and not an attack on Erika or anyone here, but how the news was covered also is important. The first coverage it kind of just mentioned Oaxacans. Nobody paid attention to Indigenous, to the impact of Indigenous communities, and did not mention that LA is such a big Indigenous city, right? And I think that needs to change from every newspaper, how it was handled without mentioning it. It's not until we come out with a press conference ourselves and with a march ourselves, they're like, wait, there's Oaxacans in these cities? Well, what do you mean Indigenous, right? So all the coverage, we've been reading them along with one of our board members, and the mention of Indigenous peoples is not there. You cannot summarize our existence in one sentence or two sentences, right? So that's also important for the media to dedicate more time to the existence of Indigenous people. I think those are the changes that need to come from all the media. But I think there's positive things, like we're going to continue having conversation with our Black relatives. These KDO is not going to let us work when they come back. So we need to figure out ways for us to build the movement around him and move forward, learning from each other's struggle. Because one of the things that really impressed Indigenous communities was when we explained the Black movement before us, the civil rights movement, gave us a lot for us to even be able to live in South Central, for us to be able to be a business. It came from this movement. So those are the things I'm hopeful for that we're going to build. But as for the city, we're stuck. I hope there's some reflection, on KDL's behalf during these days that we're off, and keep away from the public for a minute. Let us just enjoy our holidays, and we'll deal with you when you come back, because it's really causing kids to cry, trying to really impose yourself, gaslighting the communities is not a good way to move forward. But also, yeah, I think that is my 2 cents.
Odilia just gave us the roadmap to the kind of transformative organizing that I was mentioning.
There you go. Well, thank you all very much. So our conversation, the panel conversations ran over a little bit, which of course was very likely to do. And I'm grateful for all of your thoughts. It just means that we have less time for our Q&A. I want to remind everybody, though, that this is the first in a series. So this is an extended conversation in that sense. I'll run through one question and just ask if maybe one of you might want to touch on it really quickly before we close. I think several of these have probably already been answered, but I'll take this one question. So it goes. I appreciate the acknowledgement that the anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous sentiments were broadly pre-existent before the late recording. White supremacy is deeply interwoven in the Latino community or culture. Here's the question. What are some practices and investments? So an additional, but beyond what we've already talked about, what are some practices and investments that Latino organizations and coalitions need to prioritize to repair harm, rebuild trust, increase authentic Black and Brown solidarity? Anything else that anyone wants to jump in on this?
I think one thing that language is fundamental to everything, right? In the case of Indigenous people, a lot of us don't speak Spanish. We speak our Indigenous languages, so we're not able to communicate with our Black relatives, and they don't speak Spanish. So I think going back to the mission of CIELO, language is a basic human right, and it's a connector to all of us. And when we don't speak the same language, we get lost. And in our case, all these things are bombarded to us in mass media, and so is the community. But I think we got to think of language as a connector for us because we have the same struggles. We felt that the same racism that we see in these transcripts or in this conversation is really anti-Black, anti-Indigenous. But hey, if we don't know that our enemies the same, it's hard to build a coalition. So in that sense, this recording really brought that up. Like, language is everything.
Thank you.
The thing I would add is that what relational organizing tells us is that we need to tell each other stories. And so one of the things that I think is really critical, Odilia pointed to the idea of for Latino communities learning about the anti-Blackness that's been persistent in the United States, the anti-indigeneity too, and how that structures the systems of disadvantage and disinvestment that create problems for Latinos in the United States and Latinos born in the United States as well. There are great groups that have been doing this, like Community Coalition in South Los Angeles, by bringing people together and listening to each other's stories. In the Black community, I'm always struck by the great book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the Great Migration. But about every 50 pages, Isabel Wilkerson kind of takes a quick nod and says, gosh, isn't that a lot like immigrants today? So that I think being able to see each other in each other's stories and in each other's liberation becomes a sort of lasting basis for coalition on an emotional and spiritual level. And then the politics and self-interest can follow.
I mean, I think the thing is that I think a lot of Black Angelinos feel misunderstood. I mean, I think, and not feeling that they're not seen. And I think that one of the great things I've seen about the younger cohort of folks who are very more multicultural is that there isn't as many of those divisions because people see each other for who they are and respect their cultures. And I think as long as we can do that, I think that's going to be a big part of how you rebuild trust.
Thank you. So we went a minute over, but that was a good question. Thank you all so much. I know Erika has to jump off for another call. I want to thank everyone that's tuned in today. Again, we hope to see you throughout the series, and we welcome you spreading the word and those registration links. Much more to talk about. This is just the start. I also want to thank our partners and also, of course, USC Price School and their communications department, which made all of this possible in terms of organizing and getting the webinar done. And again, recording will be distributed soon. Thank you all very much. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you for the conversation.